Hello and welcome to the Truman Library Institute's webinar series, The First 5 Days, honoring the 75th anniversary of the presidency of Harry S. Truman. Today, we're joined by Clifton Truman Daniel, President Truman's eldest grandson, who will be sharing the story of how his grandfather discovered the existence of an atomic weapon. Clifton, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
At the conclusion of the 15-minute presentation, there will be a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session. Questions can be submitted during and immediately following the remarks via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Now, it is my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Clifton Truman Daniel.
Thanks, Morgan. Hi, everybody out there in their living rooms, their dens, their basements. I hope you are all well and safe and healthy. I'm going to start off by, I think our first slide is a photo of Grandpa taking the oath of office after President Roosevelt died on April 12th, 1945. My mother remembered that night. It's one of the first stories that she ever told me. She was getting ready to go out on a date, and my grandfather called from the White House, and my grandmother came in, told my mother to change clothes, get out of the date clothes, put on something somber. And in the middle of all that, the doorbell rang, and my grandmother told my mother to go and answer the door, and my mother did in her slip, and was shocked to find a lady reporter out there asking questions, trying to stick a microphone in her face. She slammed the door in the reporter's face, but there was a lot of tension, and obviously a lot of devastating news to the nation as well as to the Truman family. It was not long after this picture was taken that my grandfather discovered the existence of the atomic bomb. He did not know that's what it was yet. Secretary of War Henry Stimson took him aside and said, "I need to talk to you about something very urgently, a top secret war matter, weapons matter, that I need to fill you in on." So that was the first inkling that Grandpa had. There he is with Secretary Stimson. Grandpa had, some years earlier, as the head of the Truman Committee, which was the committee to investigate waste and fraud and mismanagement in war production, in war production from 1942 on. Grandpa had gotten word that millions of dollars were disappearing into the middle of nowhere in Tennessee and Hanford, Washington, what was then known as Black Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington. And he knew there were just a handful of family farms there. So he sent out 2 inspectors. The word of that got back to Secretary Stimson, and the secretary came to my grandfather's office and said, "Please stop those men right now. What they're doing out there is legitimate, and it is completely top secret." And Grandpa's, first of all, we were on a war footing, so there was cooperation. So Grandpa was going to do what he was asked to do by the Secretary of War, but he also had very, very high regard for Secretary Stimson, so he called off those men immediately. Stimson, he was not filled in on the atomic bombs for nearly another 2 weeks. Stimson made an appointment with him, and I'll read you what he said. This is from a book of my grandfather's, just his musings after he left office, called Where the Buck Stops. It was edited some years ago by my mother, Margaret Truman. And Grandpa just wrote, "If I live to be 100 years old, I'll never forget the day that I was first told about the atomic bomb. It was about 7:30 p.m. on the evening of April 12, 1945, just hours after Franklin Roosevelt had died at 3:35 p.m., and no more than a half an hour after I was sworn in as president at 7:09 p.m. Henry L. Stimson, who was Roosevelt's Secretary of War and then mine, took me aside and reminded me that Roosevelt had authorized the development of a sort of super bomb, and that that bomb was almost ready. I was still stunned by Roosevelt's death and by the fact that I was now president, and I didn't think much more about it at the time. But then on April 26th, Stimson asked for a meeting in my office." And I think we have a slide coming up of the well, there it is. This is the request by Secretary Stimson to speak to my grandfather about this matter, a formal request. when he says, you can see, he says, I mentioned it to you shortly after you took office, but I've not urged it since on account of the pressure you've been under. So Stimson understood what Grandpa was going through at that time. But as he says at the end, I think you ought to know about it without much further delay. And then our next slide. There is the Wednesday, April 25th. This is nearly 2 weeks later after the 12th. And this is my grandfather's appointments through noon. And the last one you see is the Secretary of War. What is absent from that calendar is who was with Secretary Stimson. And he says, I'll start again at that sentence. But then on April 26th, Stimson asked for a meeting in Groves, who was in charge of the operation that was developing the bomb, the Manhattan Project. The meeting was so secret that Groves came into the White House through the back door. At that meeting, Stimson handed me a memorandum that said, quote, within 4 months, we shall in all probability have completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history, a bomb, one bomb, which could destroy an entire city. They went on together and with various others to form what was called the Interim Committee of leading scientists. They had the president of Harvard, president of MIT. They had some of the best minds the two of them could find. And they had input from the scientists who had developed the bomb, including J. Robert Oppenheimer. They had to decide how to use this weapon. And it had to decide whether or not to use the weapon. And Grandpa actually said, and that's one more sentence in this that's interesting. Stimson said very gravely that he didn't know whether we could or should use the bomb because he was afraid that it would end up destroying the whole world. So they had to help him make that decision, whether or not to use the bomb, and if so, how to use it. And from there, that's when that's the beginning of the decision to use the atomic bombs. And we have, am I at the end of the slides?
Yes, we now can take some questions if you're ready, Clifton, or is there anything else you would like to add?
That's great.
Okay, great.
No, that's it.
Excellent. So thank you, Clifton, for that wonderful presentation. If you have a question and haven't added it to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, please do so now. You can also like a question that's already been submitted that you would like to see answered. So our first question is from Philip, who asks, how willing were the Roosevelt cabinet to give Truman all the information he needed in all areas of national and international issues?
Hi, Philip. I've never read anything that they were unwilling. There were, of course, differences of opinions. Grandpa kept the Roosevelt administration largely in place at the beginning to keep up with continuity because they were in the middle of the tail end of a war, and they had a lot of very serious decisions to make, things that the Roosevelt administration had been grappling with for years. So he kept that in place. I've never heard or read that he had, again, differences of opinion, but Grandpa could certainly handle that. But there was never any question of withholding or not being forthcoming with information that was vital to the war effort and how he was going to continue Roosevelt's policies, which he wanted to do, and conduct the war.
All right, our next question comes from Harold. And Harold asks, did you and your grandfather ever talk about the bomb?
Hi, Harold. No, we did not. I learned about the bombs, and we didn't because I was young. I was 15 when Grandpa died, so most of my visits, I was young, and that's a tough subject. Also, frankly, I never asked. My brothers and I visited my grandparents in Independence, always on family holidays. It was always Thanksgiving or Christmas, or we went to Key West with them during spring breaks. So it was always family vacation time. And frankly, we would not have sat Grandpa down and asked him a bunch of questions. We were more concerned being out playing by the pool or running around in the yard. So I learned about the bombs from my teachers in my textbook, as I said. And those books, they don't tell you a whole lot in an American history text, in a standard American history text. Still today, the atomic bombs get a page or two. There's a picture of the mushroom cloud. There are statistics. There's reasoning, but there's not a whole lot about that. And of course, the difference between me and any other child in my class is that I could come home and fact check. If they said something, I could come home and ask my mother, "Is that true?" So that was the main difference. But I learned about it the same way you did. That said, he would never have told you anything differently than he would have told me. Grandpa was remarkably straightforward with everybody. So there is no secret family information about the dropping of the bombs. He wrote down repeatedly, and he has said repeatedly what his feelings were about it and why he made the decision he made. And that's out there for both of us.
All right. Our next question comes from Donna, who asks, when did your grandmother and mother learn of the atomic bomb, and what role did they play in supporting and or advising your grandfather?
Hi, Donna. I don't know when Mom learned about it. Of course, she certainly learned about it after it was used on Hiroshima. So she certainly knew by then. My grandmother may not have known by then either. I would have to go back and look through my mother's book on my grandmother, Bess W. Truman. I do remember from Mom saying, and from that book, that my grandmother was actually a little, I won't say angry or upset, but she was surprised that he had not, she felt a little upset that he had not confided in her. And of course he wouldn't. But they had all through their marriage and his political life together, his career, they had always been completely open with each other. He could talk to her about anything, and she often provided advice and feedback. She was a great sounding board. She critiqued his speeches. She helped him make decisions at times. But this was too big a national secret and a wartime secret for him to have said anything. But Mom said that she thought that my grandmother was disappointed that she did not know that he held something back. And I think that was more in the nature of, not that she wanted to know national secrets, but that she had been privy to everything he was going through until that point.
All right. Our next question is from Sandy. And Sandy asks, did he ever regret the decision?
Hi, Sandy. He has said no, that he didn't regret it. He did and he didn't. He never regretted doing what he thought he had to do to save American lives and save Japanese lives. He was being told by his various military advisors that they could expect up to 500,000 casualties in an invasion. And I think even more, 500,000 casualties on our side, and many times more that on the Japanese side in an invasion of the Japanese home islands. There's a telling statistic that in advance of that planned invasion, and plans for the invasion were well underway at that point, that in advance of that invasion, while those plans were being made, the United States government made 500,000 Purple Heart medals in anticipation of the wounds, the casualties that we were going to incur. And I believe that we are still to this day awarding those original Purple Hearts. They made so many of them that we still haven't run out. I may be wrong on that, but if we have run out, it's only been recently. So they were expecting a huge number of casualties. That said, and there's a story that from a photographer, Joe O'Donnell. He was a Marine photographer. I think it was Marines. During the war, he was one of the first U.S. photographers into Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the bombings, and he took some of the earliest photographs. Several years later, he was assigned to the White House, and he was with my grandfather at Wake Island when he went to meet General MacArthur, and they had a few minutes unguarded together, just standing together. And O'Donnell took the chance. He said, I was in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I have to ask, did you regret that? Did it bother you? And Grandpa said something to the effect of, hell yes, it bothered me. You don't make a decision like that. You don't cost that many human lives without having it bother you. So he did and did not regret it.
All right. Our next question is from Whiskey, and Whiskey asks, how much did the secret shape how your grandpa kept his VP in the loop and shaped the vice presidency to what it is now?
Hi, Whiskey. Love the name. Well, you know, at that time, he didn't have a vice president. He did not have a vice president until he ran for president in his own right in 1948. He was the vice president. The president died. He's it. So no vice president. So I guess that's a simple answer to that. Excuse me.
Okay. Our next question comes from Chris, and it is, what is your advice to teachers who teach about this event each year?
If I were a teacher, God, no teachers ever asked me for advice, Chris. Most of mine were too busy yelling at me to go ahead and finish my homework. Stop fooling around. If I had to give advice to teachers, I would say to teach broadly on the subject. As I said, my grandfather never spoke to me about the bombings. In God, I can't even, the year now. My son Wesley is 32 now, 31. When he was 10 years old, he came home from school with a book, Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes. For those of you watching who don't know that story, Sadako Sasaki was a real little girl. She was 2 years old when the bomb destroyed her home city, Hiroshima. She and her family survived, but she was diagnosed 11 years later with radiation-induced leukemia. She followed a Japanese tradition that says if you fold 1,000 origami paper cranes, you are granted health. The crane is a symbol of life and health. So this was her attempt to help in her treatment. She folded 1,300 cranes, but sadly she died of leukemia in 1955. There's a memorial to her and to all of the children killed, wounded, sickened by the bombs that stands in Hiroshima Peace Park today. That was the first personal story I had ever seen of Hiroshima. As I said, I learned about it from textbooks, but this was the first human story from the other side, from someone on the ground. And I remember telling Wesley that it was important for him to understand his great-grandfather's decision and his country's point of view, but it was equally important for him to understand what that decision cost the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Reading that book with Wesley led to, I mentioned that to a Japanese journalist. The journalist wrote a story that was read in Japan, and that led to a meeting with Masahiro Sasaki, Sadako's older brother, himself a survivor. And I met them in New York in 2010, and during that meeting, Masahiro and his son Yuji were in New York to donate one of Sadako's original cranes to the 9/11 Tribute Center as a gesture of healing. And during that meeting, Yuji dropped a tiny paper crane into my palm and said, "That's the last one that Sadako folded before she died." And at that point, Yuji's father, Masahiro, asked me if I would consider attending the memorial ceremonies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We did 2 years later. My wife Polly and I and our sons Wesley and Gates went to both memorial ceremonies, and in between sat down with more than 24 survivors, not one of whom came to us in anger or with recrimination. They only wanted to tell the story and ask us to help them keep telling the stories in the hope that none of us worldwide ever does this, ever uses those weapons again.